Hello, do you like music? I like music. Let's talk about music. Grab your favorite pair of headphones and let's listen to this. For today's Headphone Hideaway, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite bands, Glassjaw, and their 2002 release, Worship and Tribute. For those of you unfamiliar, Glassjaw are a post-hardcore band, one of the most influential bands in their genre of music, post-hardcore or whatever, ever. I don't think there are too many bands that have come out in the past 2 decades that dabble in that genre of music that can't cite Glassjaw as a huge influence. One of those bands that has always been just a little bit ahead of the curve, and one of those bands that has always kind of refused to play by the rules, which is like work to their benefit and to not their benefit in a lot of ways too, I imagine, from a business perspective. But all things considered, they've done plenty well for themselves. There's a lot that you could get into if you're going to break down the history of Glassjaw and how they've gone about being a band over the past couple of decades. It's actually a really interesting conversation. I'm sure there's somebody else on the internet that has probably broken that down better than I could. But the year this came out, 2002, was a pretty interesting time for rock and metal, especially in the underground scene, because nu metal had really dominated everything for the years prior to that, but it was starting to lose favorability in the mainstream, and also in the underground, it was definitely kind of like, we're kind of sick of it. So what you had bubbling in the underground was kind of the beginnings of the metalcore movement and the deathcore movement as well, with bands like All Shall Perish and Misery Signals and Despised Icon starting to form and, make some noise. But also on the flip, pop punk and its popularity of the late 90s had kind of faded out, and all of the people in the underground that were a part of that demographic were starting to gravitate towards bands like Thursday and Under Oath, and the whole screamo movement was really starting to build up. So somewhere in between all of that, somewhere in between the nu metal movement and the post pop punk movement, screamo, post-hardcore thing, you get Glassjaw. Now, Glassjaw has been pretty active since the mid-90s, meaning that they were doing the damn thing all throughout the mainstream wave of nu metal and pop punk, and to some degree, they were lumped into those genres. They toured with bands in those genres. They were liked by fans of those genres, but they were never really quite either of those genres. I mean, I believe most people consider Glassjaw a post-hardcore band. If you've watched my videos in the past, especially my Blood Brothers video, I have a huge issue with the term post-hardcore just because it can mean way too many different things. But in the same way a band like Blood Brothers never really fit into one particular box, Glassjaw is exactly the same. But these are two totally different bands. 2002 was just a strange time for metal, rock, underground music in general. And as somebody who was a teenager in 2002, I was starting to, walk on my own path of discovery, looking for new, exciting, more extreme things in terms of the world of metal. I had graduated from Slipknot into Dimmu Borgir and Emperor and Cradle of Filth and all that stuff, and even some stuff that wasn't as hard, bands like Opeth or even Nightwish. I loved all of that stuff. Children of Bodom, I could keep going. So my brain was so tied into all of that a band like Glassjaw totally just escaped my radar. I knew that they were a band. Had friends that were into Glassjaw. Glassjaw was touring with bands that I liked once upon a time, and I was just very aware. But, being 16, 17 years old, finding, European metal, listening to At the Gates and shit like that, this was just, I just didn't care at the time. But what I believe happens with everyone, especially people that go down that extreme path of listening, your ears get burned out and you start to turn to things that maybe you overlooked, start to go back in time a bit, and it was probably around 2006 or 7 when I finally stumbled back into Glassjaw and this album. Now, Glassjaw was a band that I already said before I was familiar with, but I had like reasonably negative connotations about this band because, you know, they're kind of like pickles in a way, where there are people that really love pickles and they'll eat pickles on anything. They're all about pickles. But there are some people that fucking hate pickles. They can't smell a pickle. Don't talk to them about pickles. Don't show them a picture of a pickle. They're like, fuck pickles forever. It doesn't matter what kind of pickle it is. They do not give a shit. They want nothing to do with that pickle. And there's a lot of people in my life that have been like that with Glassjaw, because, you know, when you're talking about rock and metal of the late 90s, early 2000s, you're talking about Godsmack and Puddle of Mud and Red Hot Chili Peppers making hits and Foo Fighters. Nothing against any of these bands. These were just, that's what popular rock was in 2002. I feel as though Glassjaw have always been a band that, you know, in terms of business, definitely never wanted to really play by the rules and definitely, you know, wanted to do things their own way. And that ideal transcends 110% to their music. You can listen to any Glassjaw album. It doesn't matter if it's Worship and Tribute or Everything Everyone to Know About Silence or even the newer stuff. Their latest album, Material Control, is very much them to a T 100%. Anytime I listen to Glassjaw, I only hear Glassjaw. There are other bands that I can listen to and also hear Glassjaw, but I never hear another band when I'm listening to Glassjaw. With the exception maybe sometimes of like early Faith No More from time to time. And most of that is just because, you know, that era of Mike Patton's vocals and Daryl Palumbo on this record, they have very similar, like, lack of giving a shit in terms of how animated they decide to take their voices from time to time. And I think that it's really, really one of those things that turns a lot of people off of the band. Daryl Palumbo and Mike Patton are both very dominant vocalists, whereas like sometimes it could be hard to hear what else is going on in the song because they have so much presence on the track. Your homeboy from Protest the Hero is the same way too. I don't remember his name, and these are three very, very different bands, but I'm just thinking about vocalists in general that are just dominating forces where like you could really miss what's going on in the intricacies of the music sometimes in these tracks, just because like as vocalists they're so fucking on top of the track and just conquering everything, which is really cool. But it's definitely a turnoff, I think, for some people because his voice isn't necessarily the easiest to listen to at times, but that's kind of the point. You know, at this time, clean vocals in hardcore and metal and things like that, that wasn't really something that you were supposed to do in the underground scene. It's funny how much it flipped in the years post Worship and Tribute, but at the time, this was kind of like a no-no in the underground scene, especially in terms of like hardcore and the demographic that Glassjaw was coming out of. You know, this isn't a fucking nu metal record, but this also isn't a hardcore record. This is something all its own. Talking about popular bands in 2002, there's definitely an elephant in the room here that I've brought up Godsmack a couple times, and some of you may know this, and you may be wondering if I was going to bring it up, so I'm bringing it up now. Shannon Larkin, the drummer for Godsmack, plays drums on Worship and Tribute. Shannon Larkin is a motherfucker of a drummer, and the energy that he brought to these recordings is ridiculous. And the songwriting, all of the bass stuff on this album is really, really cool and intricate. The guitar work is like unlike anything else. You know, this album can be a little bit hard to also just listen to as somebody that wants to dissect the songs because the production on it is not the best. It's definitely kind of brick wall to hell and back in some sort of like loudness war battle to the death of your eardrums. And, you know, that limiting combined with the really, really loud vocals and Daryl Palumbo just being like so dominant and all the compression and everything can make it actually hard to like hear everything that's going on in all of the songs. But if you've never sat down with this album and listened to it, I definitely recommend it because it is still, you know, regardless of its few flaws in terms of production, it's undeniably one of the most influential albums in its genre. Glassjaw to this day are still a really active band. Well, they're active enough. I wouldn't say they're really active, but they're active. They do a lot of cool stuff. They're still putting out music, and they're one of my favorite bands of all time. This wasn't some fucking like, oh, let's take a bunch of stuff that's popular and mix it together to try to make something that's super popular. This was like, let's take a bunch of abstract shit and put it together to make something that's even more abstract. I just wanted to cut in here real quick. So when listening to this album again now, as I'm currently in the middle of doing, you know, Daryl Palumbo's vocals don't seem that extreme or wildly different, you know, from a 2021 perspective. But, you know, if you've never listened to this album and you decide to check it out, keep in mind that like nobody was really doing shit like this at the time. And while it would eventually be molded into something that would become incredibly popular, you know, for the time, especially in the realm of like heavy underground music where Glassjaw was really cutting their teeth, you know, this was fucking unheard of. And for them to kind of like come out swinging and do this in a scene where like, you know, this kind of shit wasn't welcome at all and really just basically be like middle fingers in the air, like this is who we are and really stick to it. You know, they ended up creating their own thing and, you know, it birthed a lot. So wildly influential. That's just something that I definitely want people to keep in mind if you haven't heard this before or if you haven't listened to it in a long time and you're going back to listening to it. Just like keep in mind what the landscape was like of underground music at the time and like just like, you know, how ahead of the curve this album was. It's really, really cool to look back on these things, you know, multiple decades after the fact and be like, oh, it all came from here. Pretty cool. I mean, you could nitpick and again, like think about how a lot of Daryl Palumbo's style probably came undeniably from someone like Mike Patton. But in the realms of underground music, it's not hard to get on the topic of all roads leading to Mike Patton. You know, but even Mike Patton had his own influences and we don't got to go down that rabbit hole now. Perhaps another day when I do a Faith No More video, which is inevitable. But yeah. That's enough for this interruption. Back to the video. As long as underground rock and metal exists, Glassjaw is going to be one of the most influential bands within it. So if you've never given this album a listen, I highly suggest it. And for those of you that don't like Glassjaw, but maybe you sat through this whole video, consider revisiting Glassjaw from a different perspective. And if you still aren't into it, that's totally cool. I get it. In terms of like the mainstream, I think Glassjaw is still one of those bands that never really quite got their due. I don't think they've been recognized in the way that I feel they personally should be, but also a lot of that is on them as well. I don't know how much they want to be recognized as a band that has, you know, walked away from major label stuff and then decided to operate as a fully DIY functioning band. I totally respect the hustle. 1000%. How can you not as a fellow underground artist? But, you know, I think a lot of those decisions that they made from a business perspective early on in their career definitely led to this band being a bit more obscure in terms of the mainstream, where, you know, I think that honestly, this band is just as good, if not better, than any other band that was super popular in the early 2000s and to date. But that's how it goes, though, right? That's how it always goes. I think I've talked enough about Glassjaw, so I'm gonna go. That's it. That's the end of the video. Goodbye.